Okay, in the last lecture, we talked about baselines and principal meridians. So let's take a closer look at that now. As settlers moved westward, in each area where substantial amount of surveying was needed, an initial point would be established within the region to be surveyed. Now, from this initial point, that's where they would start their surveys, and then every survey they did would be tied to that original point. The initial point for Washington, Oregon was set just west of what is now downtown Portland, Oregon. And the initial point was known as the Willamette Stone. We're going to take a look at it in the next slide. So here's a picture of the Willamette Stone. You can see in the very top the round monument, and that's where all the surveys from Washington and Oregon all relate to either directly or indirectly to that point right there. And the plaque underneath of it just explains a little bit about what the Willamette Stone is, and you'll notice that there is a graph of a township on the left-hand side, and it's a nice little park. If you ever get the chance, it's just west of downtown Portland up on the side of a hill, and it's really something to see. From that initial point, a principal meridian was run. Now, the word meridian you're going to hear a lot. All it is a true north-south line. From each initial point, a true north-south line was called a principal meridian and was run to the limits of the area to be surveyed. Now, our principal meridian from the Willamette Stone runs north to the Puget Sound, and then they offset it and ran it up to the Canadian border, and it runs south to the California border. And as I just said, in Washington and Oregon, the principal meridian was known as the Willamette Meridian. You'll hear that all the time, or you'll see it abbreviated WM, and runs north to Puget Sound and south to the California border. Now, as they were running this principal meridian, they would set monuments every 40 chains. Now, if you remember that there's 80 chains in a mile, then 40 chains is a half mile. So every 40 chains, they would set a monument on this principal meridian and what they called standard position, where they're supposed to be. So we had monuments heading north and south every half mile. Now that we have the principal meridian being run, they would also run a baseline, which would be perpendicular to the principal meridian and would be a true line of latitude, and it would run east and west to the limits of the area to be surveyed. Now, the baseline for Washington and Oregon goes west to the Pacific Ocean and east to the Idaho border. Now, as the baseline was run, the surveys would put monuments in every 40 chains in standard position. Now, you'll notice that I'm saying that standard position a lot, and you'll see that that becomes an important thing when we get into other parts. But what they would do is they would go every 40 chains and set a monument. So now we have monuments running every half mile north and south and every half mile east and west on the baseline. Baselines, being lines of latitude, are curved, and these lines are known as rhumb lines. The baseline in Washington, as I told you before, throughout Washington and Oregon, begins at the initial point, extends west of the Pacific, and east to the Idaho border. Now, these baselines, because they're lines of latitude, they had to be surveyed in a certain way. And the 73 manual had three ways of laying out these parallels of latitude. The first one was called the solar method. The second one was called the tangent method. And the third one was called the secant method. And we're going to stop this lecture here right now, But in our next lecture, we're going to talk about how each one of these methods you use to lay out these baselines or these true lines of latitude. Okay, in this lecture, we kept it pretty short. We just talked about the initial point. We talked about the Willamette Stone and where it is. We talked about principal meridians and putting monuments in every 40 change in standard position. We talked about baselines, true lines of latitude, and putting monuments in every 40 change in standard position. And we hinted about the three ways you can lay out a true line of latitude: using the solar method, using a tangent method, and using the secant method. And we're going to discuss all three of these in the next lecture.